Welcome to Revenge Stories with Dad, where powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption come to life. Follow along as a father figure shares gripping tales filled with wisdom, emotion, and unexpected twists. Sit back and experience revenge told with calm strength and unforgettable impact.
My hat. When I came back, the manager yanked me into the kitchen and bolted the door. "Don't scream, just watch," he begged, pointing to the security monitor. He rewound the tape. When I saw what my son dropped into my wine while I was in the restroom, I hit the floor. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought a forgotten hat would save my life." But on that Tuesday evening in October, when I walked back into Beaumont Bistro to retrieve it, I discovered something that shattered everything I believed about my son. My name is Sidney Hammond, and at 63 years old, I thought I knew who I could trust. After losing my husband Robert 2 years ago, Charles had become my anchor, my only family, or so I believed. The evening started like so many others had over the past few months. Charles called around 3 o'clock, his voice carrying that careful tone he'd been using lately, the one that made me feel like I was made of glass. "Mom, how about dinner tonight? That place you like, Beaumont Bistro?" I hesitated. We'd been there 4 times in the past 2 months, which seemed excessive for Charles, who usually preferred chain restaurants. But I was lonely and my son's attention felt precious these days. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart. 7 o'clock? Perfect. And Mom, maybe we could share a bottle of wine. You've seemed so tense lately." I frowned, touching the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. Tense? I hadn't felt tense until Charles started pointing it out. "I don't usually drink wine, you know that." "Come on, Mom, 1 glass won't hurt. You deserve to relax." There it was again, that insistent tone wrapped in concern. I found myself agreeing, though something in my chest tightened. Beaumont Bistro sat on Maple Street like a warm jewel against the October evening. The amber lights spilled through tall windows, and the familiar scent of garlic and rosemary greeted me as I stepped inside. Charles was already there, seated at table 12 near the kitchen entrance. His fingers drummed against the mahogany surface, and he kept glancing at his watch. "You're early," I said, settling into the chair across from him. The soft jazz playing overhead couldn't quite mask the tension radiating from my son. Traffic was light. He signaled the waiter immediately, which wasn't like Charles. He usually took forever to decide what to order. "Let's get that wine, shall we? The Pinot Grigio you liked last time." I didn't remember liking any Pinot Grigio, but I nodded anyway. Lately, my memory felt like Swiss cheese, full of holes I couldn't explain. Dr. Peterson had mentioned it might be early signs of cognitive decline, something that terrified me more than I cared to admit. The waiter, a young man with kind eyes, brought our wine. Charles immediately lifted his glass. "To family," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "To family," I echoed, though the word felt heavy on my tongue. As we talked, I noticed Charles kept checking his phone, typing quick messages. When I asked about Maggie, his wife, he waved dismissively. "She's at her book club. You know how she is about her social commitments." But Maggie had never mentioned a book club to me. In fact, she rarely mentioned anything to me at all. Our relationship had always been politely distant, but lately it felt actively cold. "Charles, is everything all right? You seem distracted." He looked up sharply. "Everything's fine, Mom. Why would you ask that?" "You keep looking at your watch and your phone." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm just making sure we don't stay out too late. You know how confused you get when your routine is disrupted." Confused. There was that word again. When had I become the confused one? When had my own son started speaking to me like I was a child? "I don't feel confused," I said quietly. "Of course you don't. That's the nature of these things." His voice carried a patience that felt practiced, rehearsed. "Dr. Peterson explained it to me. The early stages are subtle." "The early stages of what?" Dr. Peterson had mentioned some concerns, but nothing definitive, nothing that warranted the way Charles had been treating me like I was losing my mind. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to visit the restroom. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 63 years, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The overhead lighting was harsh, highlighting lines I didn't remember having 6 months ago. When I returned to our table, Charles was sliding his phone into his pocket, and there was something different about his expression. Satisfied, maybe, or relieved. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Perfect." He lifted his wine glass again. "Drink up, Mom. You've barely touched yours." I looked down at my glass. Had I forgotten drinking half of it? The wine tasted slightly bitter, different from how I remembered Pinot Grigio tasting, but then again, my taste buds weren't what they used to be. As the evening progressed, I felt increasingly drowsy. Not drunk exactly, but foggy, in a way that reminded me of the medication I'd taken after Robert's funeral. My thoughts felt wrapped in cotton, and I had to concentrate harder than usual to follow our conversation. "You should really consider updating your will, Mom," Charles said as he paid the check. "Things have changed since Dad died. You want to make sure everything is in order." "My will is fine," I managed, though speaking felt like swimming through molasses. "Is it, though? When's the last time you reviewed it? Can you even remember?" I couldn't remember, but then again, I couldn't remember much of anything lately. The doctors said stress could cause memory issues, and losing Robert had certainly been stressful. Charles helped me to my feet, his hand firm on my elbow. "Careful, Mom, you seem unsteady." I was unsteady, though I couldn't understand why. I'd only had 1 glass of wine, and I'd eaten a full dinner. Outside, the October air was crisp and clear, cutting through the fog in my head slightly. Charles walked me to my car, watching as I fumbled with my keys. "Maybe I should drive you home," he said, but there was something calculating in his offer. "I'm fine." The words came out more forcefully than I intended. "It's only 6 blocks." He hesitated, then nodded. "Call me when you get home." "Promise?" I promised, though part of me wondered when my son had become so controlling, or maybe I was just noticing it for the first time. The drive home was uneventful, but by the time I reached my house on Elmwood Drive, the drowsiness was overwhelming. I barely managed to change into my nightgown before collapsing into bed, sleeping more deeply than I had in months. I woke the next morning feeling like I'd been drugged, my mouth dry and my head pounding. It wasn't until I was making my morning tea that I realized I'd forgotten my hat at the restaurant. The hat was nothing special, just a simple navy cloche that matched my outfit. But it had been Robert's favorite, and the thought of losing it made my chest tight with grief. I decided to drive back to Beaumont Bistro to retrieve it. The lunch crowd was just beginning to arrive when I pushed through the restaurant's heavy doors. The hostess, a young woman with bright red lipstick, smiled politely. "I was here last night for dinner," I explained. "I think I left my hat." "Of course. Let me check the lost and found." While she searched, I wandered toward table 12, where Charles and I had sat. Something about the evening felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The drowsiness, Charles's strange behavior, the way he'd kept checking his phone. "Ma'am?" The hostess returned with my hat, but her expression was troubled. "Actually, could you wait just a moment? I think the manager wants to speak with you." Before I could ask why, a stocky man in his 50s emerged from the kitchen area. His name tag read Tony, and his face was grave. "Mrs. Hammond, I'm Tony Reeves, the manager here. Could I speak with you privately?" My heart began to race. "Is something wrong?" He glanced around the dining room, then gestured toward the kitchen. "Please, ma'am, it's important." I followed him through the swinging doors, past busy prep cooks and steaming pots. He led me to a small office off the main kitchen, closing the door behind us. A security monitor sat on his desk, its screen divided into multiple camera feeds. "Mrs. Hammond, I need to show you something, but I want you to know this is very difficult to watch." "What are you talking about?" Tony's hands were shaking slightly as he rewound the security footage. "Last night, Around 8:30. Your table was in direct view of camera 3. The screen showed table 12 in grainy black and white. I could see myself and Charles, the wine glasses, the familiar scene from the night before. Tony fast-forwarded through several minutes of normal dinner conversation. "Watch carefully now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is when you went to the restroom." On screen, I watched myself stand and walk away from the table. Charles immediately pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then looked around to make sure no one was watching. What happened next made my blood turn to ice. Charles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial. With practiced efficiency, he emptied its contents into my wine glass, swirling it gently to mix whatever it was with the remaining wine. Then he sat back, sliding the vial back into his pocket, and checked his watch again. I felt the world tilt sideways. My own son, my only child, had drugged me. "Mrs. Hammond?" Tony's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, and I gripped the edge of Tony's desk to keep from falling. My son had poisoned me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity why I'd been feeling so confused, so forgetful, so unlike myself. It wasn't age, it wasn't stress, it wasn't early cognitive decline, it was Charles. The security footage played again, and each time I watched my son dump that vial into my wine glass, another piece of my reality crumbled. Tony had offered me a chair, water, even suggested calling someone, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the screen and watch my own child poison me. "How long have you been watching this happen?" I finally whispered. Tony's face was grim. "Last night was the first time we caught it on camera, but—" He hesitated, running his hand through his graying hair. "Mrs. Hammond, your son has made reservations here 7 times in the past 4 months. Always the same table, always insisting you have wine, always when you go to the restroom." 7 times. 7 times Charles had drugged me, and I had attributed my confusion and memory loss to grief, to age, to some failing in myself. The shame burned in my throat like acid. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The question came out harsher than I intended. "We suspected, but we couldn't be sure. People do all kinds of things at dinner. Add sweetener, medication, supplements. But last night, the way he looked around first, the way he hid the vial—" Tony shook his head. "I've been in this business for 22 years. I know what suspicious behavior looks like." I thought back to all those dinners, all those evenings when Charles had been unusually attentive, insisting we go out, encouraging me to relax and have a drink. The pattern was so clear now, so obvious, I felt sick with my own blindness. "What kind of drug?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "I'm not sure, ma'am. But based on how you looked when you left last night, something to make you drowsy and confused. Maybe something to affect your memory." Memory. The word hit me like a slap. All those conversations with Dr. Peterson about my forgetfulness, my confusion, all those worried looks from Charles when I couldn't remember conversations we'd supposedly had, all those gentle corrections when I misremembered events. "Oh my God," I breathed. "The doctor visits." Tony leaned forward. "What about them?" "I've been seeing Dr. Peterson about memory issues. He's been concerned about early signs of cognitive decline." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "Charles has been coming with me to these appointments. He's been describing my symptoms to the doctor." The symptoms Charles himself was causing. Tony's expression darkened. "Ma'am, I think you need to call the police." "No." The word came out faster than I'd intended. "Not yet. I need to understand what's happening first. Why would he do this to me?" But even as I asked the question, possibilities were forming in my mind. Money, control, my house, my savings, the life insurance policy from Robert that I hadn't touched. Charles had been asking about my finances more frequently lately, suggesting I might need help managing my affairs. "Can you make copies of that footage?" I asked. Tony nodded. "Already done. I burned it to a disk the moment I saw what happened. He handed me a small envelope. "Mrs. Hammond, whatever your son is planning, this is evidence of a serious crime." I tucked the envelope into my purse with trembling hands. "Thank you. And Tony? Please don't mention this to anyone yet. If Charles finds out, I know." I didn't finish the sentence because I couldn't bear to voice what I was thinking. If my son was willing to drug me repeatedly, what else was he capable of? The drive home passed in a blur. My quiet neighborhood on Elmwood Drive looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything felt different. The Victorian house Robert and I had shared for 32 years no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Inside, I made a cup of tea with shaking hands, trying to process what I'd learned. The kitchen smelled like the lavender sachets I kept in the drawers, the same comforting scent that had always meant home. Now it just reminded me how alone I was. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed Charles breakfast every morning for 18 years, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd planned his wedding to Maggie. The irony was crushing. My phone rang, Charles's name lighting up the screen. For a moment I considered not answering, but I needed to act normal. I needed to think. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom, how are you feeling today? You seemed pretty tired last night." The concern in his voice was perfect, practiced. How long had he been perfecting this act? "I'm fine," I managed. "Just a little foggy this morning." That's what I was worried about. These episodes seemed to be getting more frequent. There was a pause and I could hear him typing, always coordinating with someone. "I think we should schedule another appointment with Dr. Peterson." Another appointment. Another chance for Charles to describe symptoms he was creating, to paint a picture of a woman losing her mind. I felt nauseous. "Maybe you're right," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Good. I'll call his office this afternoon. And Mom, I was thinking maybe Maggie and I should start helping you with some of your paperwork, bills, financial planning, that sort of thing, just until we get a better handle on these memory issues." Financial planning. There it was, the real reason for months of careful poisoning. Charles wanted control of my money. "That's very thoughtful," I said, each word feeling like swallowing glass. "But I'm managing fine." "Are you, though? Last night you seemed really confused about some basic things, and last week you forgot our dinner plans completely." I hadn't forgotten dinner plans because there hadn't been any dinner plans, but if Charles said there had been, if he'd told Dr. Peterson I was forgetting things, who would believe me? "We'll talk about it later," I said. "I should go." "Of course, rest up. I'll check on you tomorrow." He would check on me tomorrow, like the dutiful son he'd trained everyone to believe he was, like the concerned child taking care of his aging mother. After I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the family photos on my refrigerator. Charles at his high school graduation, beaming with pride. Charles on his wedding day, his arm around Maggie, both of them laughing. Charles holding my first grandchild, a child who had miscarried at 3 months, a loss that had devastated all of us. Or had it devastated all of us? I found myself questioning everything now, every memory, every moment of shared grief or joy. How long had Charles been capable of this level of deception? I pulled out the disc Tony had given me and stared at it. 22 years of believing I knew my son, and this small piece of plastic contained proof that I didn't know him at all. My phone buzzed with a text message from Charles. "Love you, Mom. Just want to make sure you're taken care of." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Even his expressions of love were manipulations now, ways to make me doubt my own perceptions, to make me grateful for his attention even as he systematically destroyed my autonomy. I thought about Robert, about how he'd worried about leaving me alone. "Charles will take care of you," he'd said in those final weeks. "He's a good man, Sydney. He loves you." Robert had been wrong. Or maybe Charles had changed after his father's death. Maybe grief had broken something in him, or maybe the person I thought I'd raised had never existed at all. I walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. Robert's reading chair in the study, still positioned exactly where he'd left it. the grandfather clock in the living room that chimed every hour, marking time I no longer felt I could trust. The photographs on the mantel, a lifetime of memories that now felt contaminated by doubt. In Robert's study, I found the files I'd been avoiding since his death. Insurance policies, investment accounts, the deed to the house. Everything was in my name now, everything Charles would inherit when I died. But what if he didn't want to wait? I sat at Robert's mahogany desk and opened my laptop, something I'd been doing less and less lately because the computer seemed to confuse me more than it used to. But now I wondered if that confusion had been chemically induced. I searched for information about drugs that could cause memory loss, confusion, disorientation. The list was terrifyingly long. Benzodiazepines, sleep aids, even some antihistamines in large enough doses. All of them could cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing. Then I searched for something else. Financial elder abuse. The statistics were staggering. Family members were responsible for the vast majority of financial crimes against older adults. Sons and daughters trusted with power of attorney, slowly draining their parents' accounts. Adult children convincing doctors their parents were incompetent, then taking control of their finances. It was a playbook, and Charles was following it perfectly. My phone rang again, Maggie's name this time. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Sydney, how are you feeling?" Her voice carried the same practiced concern as Charles's. "I'm fine, Maggie. Why?" "Charles mentioned you had another one of your confused episodes last night. He's really worried about you." Another one of my confused episodes, as if they were a regular occurrence, as if everyone knew about them except me. "I'm not confused," I said carefully. There was a pause, the kind of pause people make when they're choosing their words carefully. "Of course you don't feel confused, Sydney. That's part of the condition. Charles and I were talking, and we think it might be time to consider getting you some additional help around the house." Additional help, a caregiver, probably. Someone to monitor me, to make sure I was taking my medication, to witness my declining mental state. Someone who could testify later that Sydney Hammond was clearly not competent to manage her own affairs. "That won't be necessary," I said. "Well, we can discuss it when you're feeling more like yourself." Another pause. "Charles is setting up that appointment with Dr. Peterson. We want to make sure you get the help you need." After Maggie hung up, I sat in Robert's chair and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly like myself. It had been months, maybe longer. The drugging explained the recent incidents, but what about before that? Had Charles been planning this since Robert's death? Had he been waiting for me to be vulnerable, alone, dependent on him? I thought about the will Maggie had mentioned, the documents Charles wanted me to review. I pulled out my copy from the filing cabinet and read through it carefully. Everything was straightforward. Charles would inherit the house, the savings, the investments. But there were conditions, safeguards Robert had insisted on. Charles couldn't sell the house for 5 years. The money was tied up in a trust that distributed gradually over time, unless I was declared incompetent. Then, Charles would have immediate access to everything. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money, this was about erasing me entirely, making me disappear into my own confusion while my son took control of everything Robert and I had built together. But I wasn't confused anymore. I was angry. And for the first time in months, my mind felt completely, crystal clear. I spent the next 3 days pretending to be the confused, forgetful woman Charles needed me to be, while secretly investigating the scope of his betrayal. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. It started with my medical files. Dr. Peterson's office was happy to send me copies of my records when I called, claiming I needed them for insurance purposes. When the thick manila envelope arrived, I spread the contents across Robert's desk with trembling hands. The pattern was devastating in its clarity. Beginning 6 months ago, right after Robert's funeral arrangements were finalized, Charles had started documenting my supposed mental decline. According to these reports, I had been forgetting conversations, losing track of time, becoming confused during simple tasks. Charles had provided detailed accounts of incidents I didn't remember because they had never happened. Or rather, they had happened, but only after he had drugged me. The most damning entry was dated 3 weeks ago. Patient's son reports increasing agitation and paranoia. Mrs. Hammond accused him of moving her things and became angry when he couldn't locate items she claimed to have placed in specific locations. Recommend cognitive evaluation and consideration of mild anti-anxiety medication to ease transition to assisted care. I had never accused Charles of moving my things, but I had been confused about where I'd put certain items, confused because whatever drug he was using affected my short-term memory, and Dr. Peterson had recommended anti-anxiety medication, which Charles could easily manipulate or increase to make me even more compliant. My hands shook as I reached for the phone to call Dr. Peterson's office directly. "I'd like to schedule an appointment," I told the receptionist, "but I'd prefer to come alone this time, without my son." There was a pause. "Mrs. Hammond, your son specifically requested that he be notified of all appointments. He's very concerned about your condition." "I understand, but I'm still capable of making my own medical decisions." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course, ma'am, but given your recent diagnosis." "What diagnosis?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Mrs. Hammond, perhaps you should discuss this with your son or Dr. Peterson directly." I hung up, my heart racing. What diagnosis? What had Charles told them that I didn't know about? I called back and asked to speak to Dr. Peterson immediately. When he came on the line, his voice carried the careful, patient tone people use with confused elderly patients. "Sydney, how are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling like I need to understand what diagnosis you've given me." A long pause. "Sydney, we discussed this last week. You have early-stage dementia, possibly Alzheimer's. We talked about treatment options and care planning." The room spun around me. "I was never given that diagnosis." "You were there, Sydney. Charles was with you. We talked for over an hour about your options." But I hadn't been there. Last week I'd been home and Charles had said he was meeting with a client. He'd visited Dr. Peterson without me, impersonated a family meeting, and received a diagnosis for a condition I didn't have. "I'd like to come in for an independent evaluation," I said carefully. "Alone." "Sydney, that's not advisable in your condition. Charles has power of attorney for medical decisions. Any new evaluations would need to go through him." Power of attorney. Charles had power of attorney for my medical decisions, and I had no memory of signing such a document. But given how many times he drugged me over the past months, given how many gaps I had in my memory, I might have signed anything. After I hung up, I searched my filing cabinet frantically until I found the folder labeled Legal Documents. Inside was a medical power of attorney form, dated 2 months ago, with my signature at the bottom. My signature, but I had no memory whatsoever of signing it. I compared it to other documents I'd signed recently. The handwriting looked like mine, but there was something slightly off about the letter formation, as if I'd been struggling to write clearly, as if I'd been under the influence of something that affected my motor control. Charles had drugged me to get my signature on a legal document that gave him control over my medical care. The implications hit me like an avalanche. With medical power of attorney and a dementia diagnosis, Charles could make decisions about my care, my living situation, my treatment. He could have me committed to a memory care facility anytime he chose. And with my supposed condition deteriorating, no one would question his authority. I was trapped in a web of legal documents and medical records that painted me as incompetent, all based on symptoms Charles had artificially created. But I wasn't going to let him win. I drove to the public library, something I hadn't done in months. Charles had been discouraging me from driving, claiming I was becoming unsafe behind the wheel. But my mind was clearer now than it had been in months, and I navigated the familiar streets without any difficulty. At the library, I used one of the public computers to research my legal options. What I found was sobering. Challenging a medical power of attorney required proving that the person who signed it was mentally incompetent at the time of signing, or that they were coerced. But with Dr. Peterson's diagnosis supporting Charles's claims, and with months of documented incidents, I would have an uphill battle. Unless I could prove the incidents were artificially created, I needed evidence beyond Tony's security footage. I needed to document the pattern of drugging, the false medical reports, the forged legal documents, and I needed to do it without Charles knowing I was onto him. When I returned home, there was a message on my answering machine from Maggie. Sydney, Charles wanted me to call and remind you about your appointment with Dr. Peterson tomorrow at 2 o'clock. He'll pick you up at 1:30. Also, we've arranged for someone from Golden Years Home Care to stop by Thursday afternoon to assess your needs. Don't worry, it's just a consultation. Golden Years Home Care. I looked them up online and found they specialized in memory care and assisted living placement. Charles was moving fast now, accelerating his timeline. The consultation would undoubtedly conclude that I needed immediate assistance, possibly residential care. I had less time than I'd thought. That evening, Charles called to check on me, his voice carrying its usual blend of concern and condescension. "How are you feeling today, Mom? You sound tired." "I'm fine, sweetheart." "Good. I wanted to remind you about your appointment tomorrow, and don't worry about the home care assessment on Thursday. It's just to see what kind of support you might need to stay in your own house." The lie slipped so easily from his lips. Charles had no intention of letting me stay in my house. He wanted me declared incompetent so he could access my assets immediately, and he needed me in a controlled environment where my protests could be dismissed as confusion or paranoia. "That sounds helpful," I said, hating how the words tasted. "I knew you'd understand. You've always been so reasonable, Mom. It's one of the things I've always admired about you." After he hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the son I'd raised and the man he'd become. When had the transformation happened? Had there been signs I'd missed, or had Charles always been capable of this level of manipulation? I thought about his childhood, searching for clues. He'd been a good student, popular, seemingly well-adjusted, but there had been incidents. A teacher's missing wallet that was found in Charles's desk, though he'd sworn he was innocent. Neighbor's cat that had disappeared after Charles claimed it was bothering him. His explanation for everything had always been so reasonable, so convincing. Maybe the capacity for deception had always been there, dormant until he needed it. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table planning my next moves. I needed to attend tomorrow's appointment with Dr. Peterson, but I needed to go in prepared. I needed questions that would expose the contradictions in Charles's story, evidence that would prove my cognitive function was normal. More importantly, I needed to start building my own case. I needed to document Charles's drugging, his lies, his manipulation of my medical records. I needed to prove that Sydney Hammond was not a confused old woman losing her mind, but a victim of systematic abuse by her own son. The irony wasn't lost on me. To save myself from being declared mentally incompetent, I would have to prove that my only child was a criminal who had been slowly poisoning me for months. But as I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by the familiar scents of lavender and lemon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Determination. Charles had underestimated me. He'd seen a grieving widow and assumed she would be easy to manipulate. He'd counted on my love for him to blind me to his betrayal. He was about to learn that Sydney Hammond was stronger than he'd imagined. The next morning, I prepared for my appointment with Dr. Peterson like I was preparing for battle. I dressed carefully in my navy suit, the one that made me look competent and professional. I practiced speaking clearly and confidently, ready to challenge any suggestion that I was confused or forgetful. Most importantly, I brought a small digital recorder, hidden in my purse. Whatever happened in that appointment, whatever lies Charles told or false diagnoses Dr. Peterson offered, I would have evidence. Charles arrived precisely at 1:30, his smile warm and concerned. "Ready to go, Mom?" "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time in months I meant it. In the car, Charles chatted casually about the weather, his work, Maggie's latest projects. To anyone observing, we looked like a loving son taking his mother to a medical appointment. But I was studying him now with new eyes, watching for tells, for signs of the deception I knew was coming. "I should mention," he said as we pulled into Dr. Peterson's parking lot, "the doctor might ask some questions that seem repetitive. He's just checking your cognitive function, making sure we're tracking your condition properly." Tracking my condition, as if my mental decline was an established fact rather than something he was actively creating. "I understand," I said, my hand closing around the recorder in my purse. What Charles didn't understand was that I would be tracking something too. Every lie he told, every manipulation he attempted, every piece of evidence I needed to expose him. The war for my freedom was about to begin, and I was no longer fighting blind. Dr. Peterson's office smelled like disinfectant and false hope. I sat in the familiar waiting room, my hand resting on the concealed recorder in my purse, while Charles flipped through a magazine beside me. To any observer, we were simply a devoted son accompanying his aging mother to a medical appointment, but I knew better now. "Mrs. Hammond," the nurse called my name with the gentle tone reserved for fragile patients. I stood, steady and determined, while Charles immediately rose to join me. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with my firmness, "I'd like to speak with Dr. Peterson alone first." Charles's eyes flickered, just for a moment before his concerned expression returned. "Mom, we discussed this. The doctor wants me there to help explain your symptoms." "I can explain my own symptoms, Charles." Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes that I'd once trusted completely. "Why don't we all go in together? Charles has been so helpful in tracking your condition." The way he said condition made my skin crawl, as if my mental state was already decided, already documented, already beyond my control. In his office, I settled into the chair across from Dr. Peterson's desk, hyper-aware of every word I was about to hear. Charles took the chair next to me, his hand resting protectively on my shoulder in a gesture that would have seemed loving to anyone who didn't know the truth. I quietly activated the recorder. "Sydney, how have you been feeling since our last visit?" Dr. Peterson asked, consulting his notes. "I feel fine, clear-headed, alert." I spoke carefully, enunciating each word. "In fact, I don't remember our last visit. When exactly was it?" Charles squeezed my shoulder. "Mom, we were here last Tuesday. We talked about your diagnosis." "I wasn't here last Tuesday. I was home all day working in my garden." Dr. Peterson's expression grew concerned. "Sydney, you were definitely here. We had a lengthy discussion about your test results and treatment options." "What test results? I haven't taken any cognitive tests." The doctor and Charles exchanged a look that made my blood boil. The look said, "See? This is exactly what we're dealing with." "Mom," Charles said gently, "you took the mini mental state exam. You scored 18 out of 30. Dr. Peterson explained that anything below 24 indicates cognitive impairment." I stared at him. "I never took any test." "You did," Dr. Peterson said softly. "Charles, perhaps you could step out for a moment. Let me speak with your mother privately." Charles hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise? She's been having more episodes lately." "What episodes?" I demanded. "Just this morning you couldn't remember where you put your car keys. Yesterday you called me 3 times asking the same question about your medication." None of this was true. My car keys had been exactly where I always kept them. I hadn't called Charles at all yesterday, let alone 3 times. But if this was what he'd told Dr. Peterson, if this was the pattern he'd been establishing for months, "I'll be fine," Dr. Peterson assured Charles. "Just a few minutes." After Charles reluctantly left, the doctor leaned forward, his expression sympathetic. "Sydney, I know this is difficult. Memory loss can be frightening and confusing, but Charles has been documenting concerning changes in your behavior for months now. What if I told you that Charles has been drugging me?" Dr. Peterson blinked. "Drugging you? What if I told you that everything he's reported about my confusion and memory loss has happened only after he's given me something? That I have video evidence of him putting drugs in my wine? The silence stretched between us. Then Dr. Peterson spoke, his voice infinitely gentle. Sydney, paranoid delusions are unfortunately common in early-stage dementia. The feeling that family members are plotting against you, that medication is being tampered with, these are classic symptoms. Paranoid delusions, classic symptoms. In 30 seconds, he dismissed my accusations and turned them into proof of my mental illness. I'm not delusional, I said firmly. I have security footage from Beaumont Bistro showing Charles putting something in my drink. Sydney, I know you believe that's what you saw, but sometimes our mind plays tricks on us. Charles loves you. He's been taking such good care of you. I felt the walls closing in. This was the trap Charles had built so carefully. Any protest I made could be dismissed as confusion. Any accusation could be labeled as paranoia. The more insistent I became about the truth, the more it would seem to prove his case. What would it take, I asked carefully, for you to believe me? Dr. Peterson considered this. Well, if Charles were actually drugging you, there would be evidence. Blood tests showing the presence of unauthorized substances. Physical evidence of the drugs themselves. Blood tests. Charles would never allow me to get blood tests that might reveal what he'd been giving me, and any drugs would be long out of my system by now. And if I could get those tests done independently? Sydney, that's not how this works. Charles has medical power of attorney. All tests and treatments have to go through him. Of course they did. Charles had thought of everything. When Charles returned to the office, his expression was carefully arranged into concern mixed with sadness. How is she doing, doctor? She's experiencing some paranoid thoughts about being drugged, very typical for this stage of the condition. Charles sighed heavily. She's been saying things like that at home, too. Yesterday, she accused me of going through her mail. Last week, she thought Maggie had moved her jewelry. He paused, looking directly at me with what anyone else would interpret as love. Mom, you know, we would never hurt you, right? The performance was flawless. Charles's voice carried just the right mix of patience and pain, the suffering of a devoted son watching his mother slip away. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have believed him completely. I'm not confused, I said, but even to my own ears, the words sounded weak. Of course you don't feel confused, Dr. Peterson said kindly. That's part of the condition. But Charles, I think we need to discuss next steps. Sydney's condition seems to be progressing more rapidly than we initially expected. Next steps. I felt the trap closing tighter. Charles nodded gravely. That's what I was afraid of. The home care assessment is scheduled for tomorrow. Maggie and I have been researching memory care facilities just in case. That might be wise, Dr. Peterson agreed. Sydney would benefit from a structured environment with trained professionals. They were talking about me as if I wasn't there, as if I was already incapable of making my own decisions. The cruelty of it took my breath away. I want a second opinion, I said suddenly. Both men turned to look at me. Charles's expression never wavered, but something flickered behind his eyes. Of course, Dr. Peterson said, but any referral would need to go through Charles, and the new doctor would need access to all your current medical records and test results. The records that Charles had helped create. The test results from tests I'd never taken. The second opinion would be based on lies, and would undoubtedly reach the same conclusion. I understand, I said quietly, though what I understood was that I was completely trapped in a system that Charles had manipulated to serve his purposes. In the car afterward, Charles was unusually quiet. Finally, as we pulled into my driveway, he spoke. Mom, I know this is scary, but Dr. Peterson and I only want what's best for you. I looked at my house, the home I'd shared with Robert for over 30 years, the place where I'd planned to live out the rest of my days. Charles was going to take it away from me, along with my freedom, my autonomy, and my dignity. I know you do, sweetheart, I said, and the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. That evening, after Charles left, I sat in Robert's study and listened to the recording I'd made. Hearing it played back was even more devastating than living through it. The way Dr. Peterson had dismissed my accusations, the way Charles had smoothly provided explanations for incidents that had never happened, the way they'd discussed my future as if I was already gone. But the recording also gave me something valuable. Evidence of how the conspiracy worked, how Charles was manipulating the medical system to support his narrative. If I could get an independent evaluation, if I could find a doctor who wasn't influenced by Charles's version of events, I researched lawyers who specialized in elder abuse, memorizing names and contact information. I couldn't call from my home phone. Charles might have access to those records, but I could use a payphone or the phone at the library. Tomorrow the home care assessor would come, and they would undoubtedly conclude that I needed immediate supervision. Then Charles would move quickly to have me placed in a facility where my protests could be dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old woman. I had perhaps 48 hours to expose the truth before I lost everything. As I sat there in the gathering darkness, I thought about the Charles I'd raised, the little boy who'd once brought me dandelions and called them flowers. When had that child become someone capable of this level of cruelty? Or had I been blind to his true nature all along, seeing only what I wanted to see? It didn't matter now. What mattered was that I finally understood the game he was playing, and I was going to find a way to beat him at it. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Charles expected me to be confused, forgetful, easily manipulated, but I was none of those things. I was a 63-year-old woman with a sharp mind and a will to survive, and I was not going down without a fight. The home care assessor would arrive at 2 o'clock, expecting to find an elderly woman in cognitive decline. Instead, they would meet someone who was very much in control of her faculties. I had a performance of my own to give, and everything depended on getting it right. The home care assessor arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, as promised. Mrs. Catherine Walsh was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a clipboard full of forms designed to measure my capacity for independent living. What she didn't know was that I had spent the morning preparing for the most important performance of my life. Charles and Maggie flanked me on the living room sofa like concerned guards, their expressions perfectly calibrated to show loving worry. I sat between them, playing the role they expected, a confused elderly woman who needed their protection. "Mrs. Hammond," Mrs. Walsh began gently, "I'm here to assess what kind of support services might help you continue living safely in your home." I blinked slowly, as if struggling to process her words. "Support services? I don't understand why I would need those." Charles leaned forward. "Mom, we've talked about this. You've been having some memory issues, some confusion. We just want to make sure you're safe." "Have I?" I asked, letting my voice carry a tremor of uncertainty. "I feel fine." Mrs. Walsh made a note on her clipboard. Over the next hour, she asked me questions about my daily routine, my ability to manage medications, my cooking habits. I answered some correctly and fumbled others deliberately, creating the impression of someone whose cognitive abilities were inconsistent. When she asked me to remember a list of 3 words and repeat them back after 5 minutes, I remembered 2 and claimed I couldn't. Recall the third. When she asked me to draw a clock showing 3:15, I made the hands slightly wrong. Every mistake was calculated to support Charles's narrative without being so obvious as to seem intentional. "Mrs. Hammond," Mrs. Walsh said finally, "do you feel safe living alone?" I hesitated, glancing at Charles. I think so. But sometimes I do get confused about things." "What kind of things?" "Well," I said, letting my voice sound small and uncertain, "sometimes I can't remember conversations we've had. Charles will tell me about something we discussed, but I don't remember it at all." Charles reached over and patted my hand. "It's okay, Mom. That's why we're here to help." Mrs. Walsh spent another 30 minutes interviewing Charles and Maggie about their observations of my behavior. They painted a picture of a woman in gentle decline who needed increasing supervision. Charles mentioned my paranoid thoughts about being drugged, which Mrs. Walsh noted with evident concern. In cases like this, she said, addressing Charles while I sat quietly beside him, we often recommend starting with daily check-ins, perhaps meal preparation services. However, given what you've described about the paranoid episodes and the extent of the memory loss, your mother might benefit from a more structured environment. You mean a facility? Maggie asked, her voice carefully neutral. Possibly. There are excellent memory care communities that specialize in early-stage dementia. The residents maintain dignity and independence while having access to professional support. I let my eyes fill with tears. I don't want to leave my home. Of course you don't, Mrs. Walsh said kindly. But sometimes what feels scary at first turns out to be the best thing for our safety and well-being. After she left, promising to send her recommendations within 48 hours, Charles and Maggie lingered in my living room. I could feel their satisfaction, their sense that everything was proceeding according to plan. That went well, Charles said, though he was looking at me carefully as if trying to read my thoughts. Did it? I'm still confused about why I need help. Maggie exchanged a look with Charles. Sydney, you heard what the assessor said. You're having memory problems and they're getting worse. We're worried about your safety. I nodded slowly, as if trying to process this information. I suppose if you think it's best. We do, Charles said firmly. In fact, I think we should have a family dinner this Sunday, just the three of us. We can talk about your options, make some decisions together. A family dinner. Where Charles would feel comfortable speaking freely, where he might reveal more about his plans, where I could finally get the evidence I needed. That sounds nice, I said. Should I cook? No, Mom. Let me handle everything. You just rest. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about what had just happened. The assessment had gone exactly as Charles had planned. Mrs. Walsh would recommend increased supervision, possibly residential care. Charles would use her report to accelerate his timeline for having me declared incompetent. But I had learned something valuable from the experience. I could play their game. I could be the confused, vulnerable woman they needed me to be, while secretly documenting everything they said and did. The family dinner would be my opportunity to get Charles to reveal the full scope of his plan. But I needed to be careful. If he suspected I was onto him, if he realized I was recording our conversations or gathering evidence, he could move quickly to have me committed before I could expose the truth. Sunday arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what I knew would be my last dinner with Charles and Maggie. I dressed carefully in a simple sweater and skirt, the kind of outfit a confused elderly woman might choose. I hid the digital recorder in my cardigan pocket, making sure it was easily accessible. Charles arrived at 5 o'clock with grocery bags full of ingredients for what had once been my favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was cooking the comfort food of my childhood for the dinner where he planned to discuss taking away everything I had left. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked as he unpacked the groceries in my kitchen. "A little tired," I said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm getting old." "We all get older, Mom. The important thing is making sure you're taken care of." Maggie arrived 30 minutes later with a bottle of wine. My stomach clenched as I watched her place it on the counter. Would Charles try to drug me again tonight? Did he think I needed to be incapacitated for this conversation? "Should we open this?" Maggie asked, holding up the bottle. "I don't think Mom should have wine," Charles said quickly. "Remember what Dr. Peterson said about alcohol interfering with her medications?" I wasn't taking any medications that would be affected by alcohol, but I nodded obediently. "You're probably right. I'll just have water." As Charles cooked, he kept up a steady stream of conversation about inconsequential things, the weather, his work, Maggie's new hobby of pottery. But I could sense the tension underneath, the weight of what he planned to discuss. During dinner, the conversation gradually shifted to more serious topics. "Mom," Charles said, cutting his pot roast into precise pieces, "Maggie and I have been thinking about what Mrs. Walsh said, about your options." "What did she say again? I'm having trouble remembering." She recommended increased supervision, possibly a care facility that specializes in memory issues. I looked up from my plate, letting confusion cloud my features. A care facility? You mean like a nursing home? Not a nursing home, Maggie said, quickly. More like an assisted living community, a place where you'd have your own apartment but with people to help you with daily tasks. But I like my house. Robert and I were so happy here. Charles reached across the table and took my hand. I know, Mom, but Robert wouldn't want you to be unsafe. He'd want you to be somewhere you could get the help you need. What kind of help? Help remembering to take your medications, help with cooking and cleaning, help when you get confused or scared. I let tears gather in my eyes. Do I get confused and scared? Sometimes, Charles said gently, like when you thought someone was drugging your wine at the restaurant, or when you accused me of going through your mail. I had never accused him of going through my mail, but I nodded as if I remembered. The thing is, Mom, Charles continued, these episodes are happening more frequently. Dr. Peterson thinks your condition is progressing faster than we initially expected. What condition? Your dementia, Mom. We've talked about this. I stared at him blankly. I have dementia? Charles and Maggie exchanged a look. Yes, Mom. Early-stage Alzheimer's disease. That's why you've been having memory problems. But I feel fine. People with dementia often feel fine, Maggie explained. That's part of the disease. It affects your ability to recognize your own symptoms. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. I activated the recorder in my pocket. I don't understand, I said, making my voice small and frightened. If I have dementia, what's going to happen to me? Charles squeezed my hand. We're going to take care of you, Mom. That's what families do. But how? I mean, what about my house, my money, all the things Robert and I saved? Don't worry about any of that, Charles said smoothly. I'll handle all the financial stuff. That's why you gave me power of attorney, remember? Did I? Yes, Mom. A few months ago, you signed the papers because you were worried about making mistakes with your bills and investments. I hadn't signed any papers willingly, but I nodded as if trying to remember. So you'll take care of everything? Everything, Charles confirmed. Your house, your savings, your investments, I'll make sure it's all managed properly. What about when I die? Will you inherit everything? Charles hesitated for just a moment. Mom, let's not talk about that right now. But I want to know. Robert always said the house should stay in the family. It will stay in the family, Maggie said. Charles's family. But what if Charles dies before me? What happens then? Another hesitation. Well, then Maggie would inherit everything. But Mom, that's not going to happen. We're going to take care of you for many years to come. I nodded, filing away this information. If I died or was declared permanently incompetent, Charles would inherit everything immediately. If Charles died first, Maggie would get everything. They had planned for all contingencies. There's something else we need to discuss, Charles said, refilling his water glass. The care facility has a waiting list, but there's been a cancellation. They have an opening next week. Next week? I let my voice rise in panic. But I'm not ready. I don't understand what's happening. That's why we need to move quickly, Maggie said, before you get more confused, while you can still participate in the decision. But what if I don't want to go? Charles's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Mom, you're not capable of making that decision anymore. That's why I have power of attorney. It's my responsibility to keep you safe, even if you don't understand what's best for you. There it was. The admission I needed. Charles was planning to use his fraudulent power of attorney to force me into a care facility against my will while taking control of my assets. I'm scared, I whispered, and for once I didn't have to fake the emotion. I know you are, Charles said, his voice softening, but you don't need to be scared. We'll visit you all the time, and you'll make new friends, people who understand what you're going through, people who wouldn't believe me when I told them I'd been drugged and manipulated. People who would see my protests as symptoms of my disease. When would I move? I asked. Next Thursday, Charles said. That gives us a few days to pack your things and get everything sorted. 4 days. I had 4 days to expose Charles before he could have me committed to a memory care facility where my voice would be silenced forever. "I think I need to lie down," I said, standing shakily. "This is all very overwhelming." "Of course it is," Maggie said. "Why don't you rest? We'll clean up here." As I walked toward my bedroom, I heard Charles and Maggie talking quietly in the kitchen. I paused in the hallway, straining to hear. "Do you think she suspects anything?" Maggie asked. "No," Charles replied. "She's exactly where we need her to be. Confused, compliant, ready to accept whatever we tell her." "And the house?" "We can put it on the market as soon as she's settled in the facility. The real estate agent thinks we can get at least $500,000 for it." "What about the investments?" "Those will take a little longer to access, but once she's been in care for 6 months, I can petition the court to have her declared permanently incompetent. Then we'll have complete control over everything." My hands shook as I listened to them plan my future, my erasure, my disappearance into a system designed to silence me. But I had what I needed now. I had their confession, recorded in their own words. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the recording I'd just made, Charles and Maggie discussing my fake diagnosis, my fraudulent power of attorney, their timeline for taking my house and assets. It was all there, clear and undeniable. Now I just had to figure out how to use it before Thursday arrived. Monday morning, I woke with the clarity of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be someone else. For months, I had been playing the role of a confused, deteriorating woman, because that's what Charles needed me to be. But today, I was going to be Sydney Hammond, sharp, determined, and ready to fight for her life. I had 3 days before Charles planned to move me to the memory care facility. 3 days to expose his lies and reclaim my freedom. My first call was to Eleanor Patterson, my late husband's cousin, and the only family member I trusted completely. Eleanor lived 2 states away in North Carolina, which had probably saved her from Charles's manipulation. When she answered the phone, her voice was warm with surprise. "Sydney, what a lovely surprise. How are you holding up?" "Eleanor, I need your help, and I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." I spent the next hour explaining everything. The drugging, the false medical records, the forged power of attorney, Charles's plan to have me committed. I played her the recordings I'd made, including the damning conversation from Sunday's dinner. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Eleanor? I'm here." Her voice was shaking with rage. "Sydney, that boy is trying to kill you. Maybe not physically, but he's trying to erase you completely." "I know, but I need help proving it. I can't do this alone." "You're not alone. Give me 2 hours to make some calls. I have a friend who's a retired federal prosecutor. She'll know exactly what to do." After Eleanor hung up, I called Tony at Beaumont Bistro. "Mrs. Hammond, I've been worried about you. How are you doing?" "I need that security footage, Tony, and I need you to be willing to testify about what you saw." "Of course. Anything you need." "There's more. I have reason to believe my son has been systematically poisoning me for months, not just that one night." "Do you keep footage from previous visits?" "We archive everything for 90 days. If you can give me dates, I can pull whatever we have." I gave him 6 dates from the past 3 months when Charles had insisted on taking me to dinner. If the pattern was consistent, if Charles had been drugging me regularly, Tony would have evidence of multiple incidents. My next call was to a locksmith. If Charles had keys to my house, if he'd been coming and going without my knowledge, I needed to secure my home immediately. While I waited for the locksmith to arrive, I went through my house systematically, looking for evidence of tampering. In my medicine cabinet, I found 2 prescription bottles I didn't recognize. Sleep aids prescribed by Dr. Peterson that I had no memory of receiving. The dates on the bottles corresponded with some of my worst episodes of confusion and memory loss. Charles had been supplementing the restaurant druggings with medication I wasn't aware I was taking. I took photos of everything, the medicine bottles, the forged power of attorney documents, the medical records showing tests I'd never taken. I uploaded the photos to a cloud storage account that Charles couldn't access, along with the audio recordings from Sunday's dinner. The locksmith arrived at noon and changed all my locks within an hour. When he handed me the new keys, I felt like I was reclaiming my own home. At 2 o'clock, Eleanor called back. "Sydney, my friend Patricia wants to conference you in with a detective she knows in your area. Detective Maria Santos specializes in elder abuse cases. Can you talk now?" For the next hour, I told my story to Detective Santos, who listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Hammond, this is one of the most sophisticated elder abuse cases I've encountered. Your son has created an entire false reality to support his claims. But you've done something remarkable. You've documented everything. The recordings alone are enough to charge him with conspiracy and fraud. What happens next? We're going to need you to file a formal complaint, and we'll need to get you to a hospital for blood and urine tests to see if any drugs are still in your system. Do you feel safe staying in your house tonight?" "Yes, I changed the locks." "Good. Can you come to the station tomorrow morning? We'll start the process of getting your medical power of attorney revoked and exposing what your son has been doing." That evening, Charles called to check on me, as he had every evening for months. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" For the first time in months, I answered honestly. "I'm feeling clear-headed, Charles. Clearer than I've been in a long time." There was a pause. "That's good. Are you excited about moving on Thursday? I think you're going to love Sunset Manor." Sunset Manor. Even the name was designed to evoke peaceful endings. "Actually, Charles, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about the power of attorney." "What about it?" "I was wondering if you could bring me the original documents. I'd like to read through them again." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that paperwork. It's all taken care of." "But I'd like to see it. It's my signature, isn't it? I should be able to read what I sign." "Mom, you're getting confused again. We've been through this. Dr. Peterson said—" "What if I told you I never took those cognitive tests? What if I told you I was never diagnosed with dementia?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "Mom, this is exactly what Dr. Peterson warned us about. Paranoid thoughts, denial of your condition. It's a classic symptom." But his voice had changed. The careful patience was gone, replaced by something harder, more urgent. "What if I told you I have recordings of you and Maggie planning to sell my house?" The line went dead. Within 10 minutes, I heard a car in my driveway. Through the window, I watched Charles get out of his BMW and walk quickly to my front door. He tried his key, but of course it didn't work. The pounding on the door was sharp, insistent. "Mom, open the door." I didn't answer. "Mom, I know you're in there. We need to talk." The pounding became more urgent. Charles was losing control, abandoning the careful facade he'd maintained for months. This was the real Charles, angry, entitled, dangerous when he didn't get what he wanted. I called Detective Santos. "He's here," I said quietly. "Charles is at my house demanding to be let in." "Stay inside. Lock all your doors. I'm sending a patrol car." For 20 minutes, Charles circled my house, trying windows, checking the back door, shouting increasingly desperate demands that I let him in. I watched from my bedroom window as he called someone on his cell phone, probably Maggie, probably Dr. Peterson, trying to coordinate a response to my sudden resistance. When the police car arrived, Charles immediately switched back to his concerned son persona. I watched him approach the officers, his body language conveying worry and frustration. He was probably telling them that his demented mother had locked herself in the house and was having a paranoid episode. But Detective Santos had briefed these officers. Instead of helping Charles gain entry to my house, they asked him to step away from the property. I opened my front door and spoke to the officers through the screen. "Mrs. Hammond, are you all right?" "I'm fine, officer, but I don't want my son on my property." Charles stepped forward. "Officers, my mother has Alzheimer's disease. She's confused and frightened. I have medical power of attorney." "Sir, we're going to need to see documentation of that power of attorney, and we're going to need to speak with Mrs. Hammond privately." The look Charles gave me through the screen door was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him before. Not the practiced concern, not the patient love, but pure hatred. In that moment, I saw who my son really was, someone who viewed me not as his mother but as an obstacle to be removed. The next morning, I sat in Detective Santos's office, signing formal complaints and providing evidence. Tony from Beaumont Bistro brought security footage from 6 different evenings, showing Charles drugging my drinks with mechanical precision. The hospital had confirmed traces of benzodiazepines in my system, drugs that weren't prescribed to me and that I had never knowingly taken. Dr. Peterson's office was being investigated for their role in the conspiracy. The medical records showing false diagnoses and fake test results were being examined by experts who could prove they were fraudulent. Most importantly, a judge had granted an emergency order revoking Charles's power of attorney and freezing any access he had to my accounts. "What happens now?" I asked Detective Santos. "Now, we prosecute. Charles and Maggie will be charged with conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. Dr. Peterson's involvement is still being investigated, but he'll likely face charges for falsifying medical records." "And me?" "You get your life back, Mrs. Hammond, your real life, not the one they were trying to create for you." That afternoon, I drove to Sunset Manor, the memory care facility where Charles had planned to imprison me. It was a pleasant enough place with comfortable common areas and cheerful staff. But it was still a place where people went to disappear quietly, where their protests could be dismissed as symptoms of their disease. I introduced myself to the director and explained why I was there. "We had no idea," she said, horrified. "Your son seemed so concerned, so devoted. He said you were in denial about your condition." I imagine he was very convincing. "What can we do?" "Help other families recognize the warning signs. Not everyone who claims a family member needs care is telling the truth." 6 months later, I testified at Charles's trial. He sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking like the successful businessman he'd always appeared to be. But the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, the forged documents, the false medical records, the recorded conversations. Maggie had pleaded guilty and testified against Charles in exchange for a reduced sentence. Dr. Peterson had lost his medical license and was facing criminal charges. The careful conspiracy they'd built to erase me had collapsed completely. Charles was sentenced to 8 years in prison for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. As the bailiff led him away, he looked back at me one last time. There was no remorse in his expression, no recognition of what he'd done, only anger that his plan had failed. I felt nothing for him. Not sadness, not anger, not even disappointment. The Charles I had loved, the son I had raised, had never really existed. He had been a mask worn by someone who saw me only as an asset to be acquired. Today I live alone in the house Robert and I shared for 32 years. I take no medications except vitamins. I drive wherever I want to go, manage my own finances, and make my own decisions about my care and my future. Eleanor visits regularly, and I've reconnected with other family members who had been told I was too confused to maintain relationships. I've also become an advocate for elder abuse prevention, working with Detective Santos to help other families recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. The irony isn't lost on me that Charles's attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent actually proved how sharp my mind really was. I had outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him, and ultimately outlasted him. I'm 74 years old now, and I've never felt more like myself. Every morning I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, living my own life on my own terms. I water my garden, read my books, and remember everything clearly. The confusion is gone. The memory lapses have disappeared. The woman Charles tried to erase has been reborn, stronger and more independent than ever. I survived my own son's attempt to destroy me, and in doing so, I discovered something I'd forgotten in the grief after Robert's death. Sidney Hammond is a force to be reckoned with. Charles had underestimated me. He thought a grieving widow would be easy prey, someone he could manipulate and control without resistance. He was wrong, and I am free.